Now we had to decide and sort of inform them what they could afford to pay us, right? Because it's all fictional. And ultimately we started out at $40 an hour at the bottom of our sliding scale. After 2.5 years in business, we raised that several times by increments up to $75 an hour. So our hourly rate was low. But we also wanted to bill less hours in the course of a case by building efficiencies, by offering things like unbundled services, and essentially figuring out other ways to get them the same results with less cost. Things like collaborative law, right? Where instead of taking a litigious approach to family law, you actually work with opposing counsel to come up with an agreement. Bringing in experts from other fields, such as therapists, to help get a recommendation put together that really, once presented to the judge is going to adopt, because they don't like to decide custody cases. And so if you give them an expert, they often are willing to just go along with that recommendation. And once everybody is aware of that, there's really not a reason to fight, right? So the goal being, we go to mediation, we bring in a psychologist to participate in the mediation, and we come out with an agreement of some kind. That saves hundreds of billable hours just right off the gate. So there were a lot of things to consider, and of course, things like how do we live off of client fees and make sure we actually get paid so that we can stay in business. And I'm proud to say that until we closed our doors of our physical office, our collections rate was 99%. And there were a lot of ways that we did that. So the next pit is less sexy because we're going to talk about some of the actual decisions that we made in order to make the firm successful. But just keep in mind that all of these technological and structural decisions that we made were for this goal of helping those who really didn't have anywhere else to go get the services that they desperately needed. So I try not to do a lot of slides. I think there's only like 10 or something. But the idea here is that we had to reconsider what success is, right? Success for a pro bono organization is very different than success for a firm. And we had to do both. So how do you define success? Is it the number of clients that you serve, which would be the impact, which is, every time you apply for a grant, that's what they want to hear about is your impact, which needs to be very large or very emotional. It can be kind of either or, depending on who your grantor is. Is it the fact that you're just simply there when there wouldn't have been an attorney there otherwise? Is it how nice your desk is? Is it, that you get awards from the bar for your service? Is it that you get your name in the paper? Is it that you get good outcomes for your clients, which are difficult to measure in family law cases, which was the bulk of what we did because it was the bulk of where the need was for that demographic. We were sort of encouraged to aim for Group A, which was the biggest impact possible, which in my opinion led to a lot of the issues that we had where our overhead had to be a lot higher because we needed a big physical office. Everybody had to have their own meeting rooms and it was just very expensive. And we felt like, the first year in business we served 647 clients and there were 19,000 family law cases filed that year. And we just thought to ourselves, gosh, we're not making an impact at all. We're not doing anything. And so we let that get into our heads because this idea was when we applied for our next grant, if we wanted to get one to help grow, which was the only purpose for grants at the time, was to increase our infrastructure. We needed to show that we were making this big splash and we were really helping a lot of people all over the place. Sometimes your impact can be small and still be very, very big. And globally, we had a huge impact. Over 50 nonprofit law firms have formed and copied our business model throughout the country. There are none in Maryland or DC, just for the record, but there are 2 in Virginia. So we'll take that. So roughly 40, I want to say 49 at this point in almost every state in the union. So we had a global impact. Locally, there are 5 in Utah. So we've managed to make a big impact while working our little 647 family law cases. And really that became, I think, the bigger measure and where we need to go in the future. So design-based thinking was a big part of this. Lawyers are bad at business. That's what I've been told my whole life. And in law school, I heard that so much, and I refuse to accept that. I think lawyers are perfectly capable of running writing a brief, you're capable of building a business plan. And so that's been the excuse for far too long. And part of that comes from we are supposed to go to law school and then go be an associate, and then they'll teach us how to be a lawyer, and we don't worry about the business part because we have people for that, right? Well, we end up being the people. That's what happens. Most of us will be a solo at some point in our career. So it's time to stop saying we're a profession and not a trade, and accept the fact that most of us will be working in a trade, and we need to know how to balance our own books. That's just the reality of the situation. So designing our business around how to be sustainable and how to stay in business. And that meant figuring out what our costs are going to be, predicting what our revenues could be, trying to figure out how many billable hours we needed to do per week, which is super weird for a nonprofit, but the reality was that was where we were going to live or die. And figuring out exactly what our rates could be, how low could they be, and how low should they be in order to get us where we wanted to go, to serve the clients, but also make sure we got paid enough to feed our families, which was the whole reason we wanted to go into business for ourselves, right, was to control our own destiny. So designing with all of those goals in mind and reverse engineering what our hourly rate could be once we figured out all of those data points. Customer service. You cannot serve the community on a sliding scale if you don't know how to provide a service that they consider valuable, because they are often choosing between all of their discretionary spending for the month and a lawyer, right? And so when you have somebody who's making $15 an hour at the maximum end and $7.25 an hour at the bottom end, you need to provide something to them, and they need to be able to see the value in that. Someone who's never hired a lawyer or any type of professional before is going to have very serious trust issues paying you even $75 an hour, right? Because that's a day's wages for a lot of them. So customer service becomes key. The use of data is critical. The reason we had 99% collections rate, and the reason we know there's a 99% collections rate, is because we were constantly gathering data and then looking back on it. And making decisions so that, for example, I know that I spend roughly 13 hours on any family law matter because most of them settle, and I know how many hours each task takes me, down to a science. And so if I get those 13 hours up front, I know that the bulk of their case is going to be paid for and that we're going to be okay, and we're not going to have to constantly ask for a replenishment of a trust, right? But also every conversation had to be about money. Every time you spoke with a client, they want to know what you've done, how much is left, how much they're going to have to pay next month. And if you're not able to provide that information because you don't have the data in front of you, it affects not only their willingness to put more money in, but it affects that customer service, like we discussed. It feels like we're shady because guess what? We're shady according to pop culture, right? Lawyers are shady. Shady and greedy according to the IRS. So building increased efficiencies, as I mentioned, so that you can bill less hours. And then lawyer well-being, which, as I mentioned, we did our best. We did things like we paid for all of their health insurance. We gave them flex time so they could bill extra hours and use it for vacation time. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's something that you have to take into account if you're going to have low billable hours to serve the community, because your lawyers are going to be working very, very hard in order to do that. So one of the considerations was, should we offer alternative fees or structures? Because if you really want to serve people and not charge very much money for it, you've got to get creative. Traditional litigation budgets are not going to work. You don't get to spend 6 or 7 hours on a brief. You just don't. Client cannot afford that. But you still have to provide not only competent but excellent representation for that client. So figuring out a way to offer alternative structures is a good way. A few examples of those would be unbundled or limited scope representation. I actually consider those things different. Unbundled would be if you were to take pieces of the case and break them up into discrete tasks, whereas limited scope I consider to be, it can include unbundled services, but it's more of full representation up till a certain threshold in their matter. And that allows you to maybe triage the case. For example, you have a spouse who is married to a very wealthy person, and that person kicks them out of the house with the kids, and they're on the street, and they have no resources, and their bank accounts are cut off. They have no way to access their money. That is someone who, once you get an initial temporary spousal support award or even attorney's fees award, in Utah we have a preemptive attorney fee award for a spouse, so the other side pays their attorney's fees in advance. Then once they've gotten that, they're no longer eligible for your services because they now have more money than they would qualify for your services. So you offer them a limited scope representation where once we get to that first court date and you start getting this money, then we triage you, we send you off to a private attorney who is able to pick up the case from that point on. Instant lawyer or lawyer for a day program, we have where you can call me up the day before a hearing and pay me a couple of hours and I'll show up. And just like was mentioned earlier, that you can actually